From the 22 News Plus studio, this is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of InFocus. I'm your host, Patrick Berry. We're here in the 22 News Plus studio. It shouldn't be news to you that we are in a housing crisis here in Massachusetts, especially in Western Mass. I have across the desk from me this morning, Kerry Spitzer. She is a senior research manager with the UMass Donahue Institute. Kerry, thank you for joining me. You have recently, worked with Wayfinders to do a study on the housing needs of our area. Umbrella, what'd you find?
Sure. So I think the big picture is, as you said, we are in a situation where housing has really become out of reach for many folks in terms of affordability. Western Massachusetts, I think the state, often focuses on Eastern Massachusetts and Boston and the high prices there. But the truth is that we're also experiencing real affordability issues in Western Massachusetts. We're just not producing enough housing, and that's been a problem that's been on for decades, and now we're really feeling the pinch as demand for housing is strong, but there's just not enough supply.
And this spans all four counties. This isn't a Hampden County, a Berkshire County. This is Hampden, Hampshire, Franklin, and Berkshire County. All four counties, we're in a housing shortage.
Yeah, that's what we found. Looked at the data, so we've seen rent prices going up over the past 5-10 years. Same thing with housing. Homeownership is out of reach for a lot of folks as prices up and interest rates, being high hasn't helped either. It's caused a lot of people to kind of lock into place, and we're seeing fewer units, going up for sale, and folks are still trying to, buy new homes or maybe move within the area, or we want to attract new folks coming in, and there just isn't enough housing right now in the community.
Is it a certain level of housing that's missing in our communities? Is it starter homes, middle homes, retiree homes, or apartments, or a little bit of everything?
I'd say it's a little bit of everything.
Okay.
I think particularly though, housing at that lower income level, we're seeing that the people who are feeling the pinch the most are renters who are but they're more likely to be cost burdened, meaning that they're spending more of their income on housing. And part of that is just because renters are more likely to be lower income households.
There's a statistic out there, it's up on the screen now, that 30% for renters, more than 30% of income is spent on housing. What's the normal, like less than 20?
No. So I think probably the stat you're thinking of is the rate of cost burden. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development defines cost burden as anybody who's spending 30% or more of their income on housing. So ideally,
So it's not just renters, it's anyone.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So homeowners, renters, the idea is that you shouldn't be spending, more than a third of your income on housing costs. Obviously, people need a place to live. So often you're seeing people who might be severely cost burdened, which is, when you spend more than half of your income on housing. And that's more likely to happen when you're lower income because you just have a, smaller pool of resources to draw on to cover the rising housing costs in our region. So when we look at renters, cost burden is a function not just of what your housing costs are, but also of what your income is. So even though rents out here are lower than, say, in Boston, we see that the rates of cost burden in Hampden County, in Franklin and Berkshire County, they're on par with what you're seeing out in the Boston area. Because just even though
even though they're lower, the percentage that you talked about is the same, whether you're in Newton or whether you're in Northampton.
Exactly, because the industry mix out here is different than what you see in Boston, and incomes are generally lower out here than you would see in Boston.
So how does Western Mass compare to Eastern Mass as far as quantity of available housing?
Well, one way of thinking about that is with vacancy. And one of the really interesting things, if you look at Franklin County, we actually have the lowest rental vacancy rate in the state, which is kind of surprising. I think often, you don't think of a rural county like Franklin as dealing with issues, but both the homeowner vacancy rates and the rental vacancy rates are far below what economists would consider like healthy. Usually, you'd want to have up to around 7% of your rental housing stock as vacant, but we're down at like 1 or 2% in some of the.
But I look at that differently and I say, well, that's good news because everybody's got a place to live.
Well, the problem is if you want to move into the area, or if you want to say you have a kid and you want to move into a larger unit, you can't find a place to move into. And so you're right. I mean, oftentimes, you want the vacancy rates to kind of hit a sweet spot where they're not so high that, there's vacant housing that's, an issue, but you don't want them so low that people are kind of locked in place and don't have options. Because when the vacancy rates are really low, that's also drives up rents. And
so people end up staying in the same place longer than what they had anticipated. So in that low vacancy rate, somebody moves into an apartment. The theory is moving into an apartment, then into a starter home, and then to sort of my long-term home.
Right. That's the American dream with housing.
But those people are moving into the apartment and they can't go anywhere from there. So they end up staying in that apartment for much longer.
Right. And also just it's a supply and demand thing. The low vacancy rate is a sign that, the demand is stronger than supply, and then the price goes up, as with any good. There's not enough.
But is that good for landlords and realtors? Because demand is high. So
sure.
One economic side of it is good.
If I, own an apartment, I do want to keep my vacancy rate low, because anytime a unit is vacant, I'd be losing income. But I think the thing is, if you're a realtor right now, I think you're struggling a lot, because you might have people coming who want to buy a home, but there just aren't any available homes. So if you can't actually have a transaction and you're a real estate agent, that's an issue.
Yeah, right. You're not making a living.
Exactly.
Right.
So
we are up on our first commercial break. When we come back, we'll dive into a little bit of the data. Stay with us. We're back after this.
This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry. This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.
Welcome back, everyone, to this edition of In Focus. I am your host, Patrick Berry. Across the desk from me is Kerry Spitzer. She's from the UMass Donahue Institute. They recently did a study for Wayfinders about the housing crisis here in Massachusetts. My camera's slightly off. There we go. Okay. And we were just talking generalities before. I want to pull up now a slide that just talks about some of the statistics. This first line, this is data as of 2025. We're 23,000 plus short in housing units in Western Mass.
Yep.
And to our first part of the conversation, it's all levels. It's apartments to luxury homes. And everything in between.
Yeah. No, I think that's the thing. It's not, and you can't really pinpoint one specific type of housing that we need. I think it's across the board. There's demand. And this figure, we look at, what is the current number of households, or what are we projecting as the total number of households in the region? And then we also think about how many households would have formed had prices not been so high. So, I'm sure you've heard stories about people who might be living with their parents longer than they would have liked, or maybe they've got roommates.
Or the parents living with the kids. Like my mother-in-law lives with us.
Exactly.
Because she can't afford a place on her own.
And sometimes that's by choice, and that's a great choice to have, but I think it shouldn't be something that folks are forced into. I think with housing, we really want to try to create a situation where people have choices about where they live and make sure that those choices align with them. But so that projection is really based on, trying to understand what are those missing households, is what we call those households, who might be doubled up or living in situations that they wouldn't have if housing prices were more normal. And then also we try to think about what would it look like if we got those vacancy rates higher? So instead of being at that, 1%.
They were at the 7%, which is preferred.
Yeah, we use like a blended rate for home ownership and rentals, around 5% for that.
Okay.
So that's where that number comes from, is kind of using our population data and then looking at those aspects of the household.
The second item on here, 36% of Western Mass renters earn less than $25,000 a year. And when you kind of do the math, it means they can afford $625 a month in rent. Yeah. There are no places in Western Mass for $625 a month.
Yeah, there really aren't. I mean, that's the thing. That the need is, I would say, we really want to focus on that need for our most vulnerable residents, which are those folks who just aren't earning enough to afford market rate housing. And so, there are a lot of ways that folks can access housing, but one way is through having access to vouchers, or sometimes there's deed restricted affordable housing in our community, but there's just not enough of that. So there's no, you know, say you would like to have a voucher and you qualify, there just aren't necessarily enough vouchers for everybody who needs them. And so part of the solution is, those folks who maybe only afford to pay $625, obviously they still need a place to live. So they end up spending more and more of their income on housing. And then they have to forego things like healthcare or food,
Right.
Other essentials for your family. And so they're then competing with maybe higher income households who are, also struggling with this housing market, and they're all competing for the same units kind of in that middle price range. And it just creates a market where it's really tough to find good housing.
Interesting. The next stat, they talk about rent increases, over the course of 3 years ending 2024, rent increases across all 4 Western Mass, in some instances, up 40%. So.
Yeah. And those are asking rents. So when you look at what people are paying who are staying in their units, those increases aren't quite as dramatic. But I think it just shows, if you're finally at a stage, maybe you're like, I want to move to a new town, or I've got a new job and I want a slightly larger apartment, and you're going to be facing asking rents that are a lot higher than what they were even just 5 years ago.
The last item on this slide, this is really eye-opening.
Mm-hmm.
When it talks about building permits issued per 1,000 people, the number of building permits issued in Western Mass is so incredibly low compared to not only the Mass average, but the U.S. average. Why is that? Why aren't we building homes here?
Well, it's a lot of factors. I'm not going to say there's any one thing. I mean, one of the factors is certainly cost. And, there's how construction costs have been up across the board, especially after the pandemic. And so that's an issue. I think the other issue is, in Massachusetts, we have 351 towns, and each one of those towns has its own process, for getting buildings permitted and built. And so builders are needing to go through different processes in each community. And sometimes folks are really, supportive of building new housing, and sometimes they aren't. And so it just creates issues.
And I have to imagine it's not for lack of desire on builders' parts, because they want to stay in business, so there's a demand, and both on the person looking for a place to live and a desire on the builder to build. So there's that missing element in the middle.
Yeah. And sometimes that, I think part of the problem is out here, the rents that people can afford to pay, or maybe the prices that they're willing to pay for new housing units mean that, it's hard for sometimes builders to break even. There was a good study by Mass Inc. showing this, looking at the return on investment for new construction in some of our gateway cities, which include places like Holyoke and Springfield. And it just shows that it can be really tricky to make it pencil out for builders in our.
What you're looking at right there, folks, is I know it's small, some data on screen, population data about the four counties of Western Mass, the units available, and so forth. So it speaks to the information that Kerry and I are talking about right now. As we look at population trends, the 2020 census came out, data came out 4 years ago in 2021. Massachusetts, what do they call it? Has more people leaving. I forget. There's a phrase.
Domestic outmigration.
Yeah, exactly. So will that continue? That domestic outmigration continue over the next 10, 15, 20 years, so that the housing crisis really isn't a crisis anymore? People are leaving, freeing up homes.
Well, so domestic outmigration is just one piece of the population picture. So it's also a function of what we demographers call natural increase, so births minus deaths. And then the other key piece is international immigration. And so the state of Massachusetts has really benefited from pretty robust international immigration, keeping the population high. And I think the focus on domestic outmigration was really big because right after the pandemic, we saw kind of a spike in that, but it's actually returned back to pre-pandemic levels. I think the thing is, if you look at the reasons people are leaving the state, one of the drivers is the cost of living. And so if we continue to have housing costs that are just really out of reach for folks who are just starting to, their professional careers. Right. We're really losing folks in that 25 to 44 age group. That's where the most of the folks who are leaving the state are. And I think part of that has got to be the high cost of housing. So if we can do something to build more housing, especially housing that could be affordable to folks in that age range, I think we could help to stem some of that population loss. But I think I want to caution that, this housing stuff isn't going to solve itself just through the population trends, because one of the things that's also happening is that we have an aging population. And as the population ages, the household size gets smaller. So you're actually seeing rising number of households even as the population declines, which I think is hard to wrap your head around.
Say that again.
So even as the population declines in some places, you'll see an increasing number of households because the households are smaller. So rather than, like I've got 3 kids, at some point they're going to, leave the house.
Move, and now you're down to 2.
And now I'm down to 2. And maybe they have fewer kids than we did, but they're still going to be forming their own household.
And that's a whole other element of population shifts. Kids are having less kids.
Exactly. Right. So, but if they're still forming households and they still want their own apartment, or home to live in, you're going to still need to build more housing units. And I think that's an important point to make, is that kind of that housing needs are shifting, and we're going to need smaller units potentially, or, more options for folks who are older and might need more accessible housing. A lot of the housing that we have in this area is very old.
Right.
And it was built.
The oldest part of the country. Yeah.
Exactly. And so a lot of it is not necessarily designed for folks who might have mobility issues or other kind of needs that are likely to develop more as the population ages.
We are up on our second commercial break. Such fascinating data. Kerry will join me back after this. Stay with us.
This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry. "22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.
Welcome back, everyone, to this edition of InFocus. Across the desk from me is Kerry Spitzer. She is a senior research manager at the UMass Donahue Institute. And today we are talking about the housing crisis here in specifically Western Mass, but it's all over the state. Is it all over the country or no?
Increasingly so, yeah.
Increasingly, but really an issue here in Western Mass.
Yeah, you see the highest housing costs kind of in the areas on the coast. So, the Californias, New Yorks, Massachusetts, but
everybody wants beachfront property.
Exactly. But the thing is, I think right now across the board in the United States, we're seeing folks who are really struggling to make to housing costs.
I'm pulling up some data now. This is the number of reported building permits that have been issued. And I forgot. Oh, this is by state going back a couple of years. Folks, look at the far, far right. In yellow is the 4 counties of Western Massachusetts compared to, are those all 50 states there?
Yeah. And
so we're dead last?
And DC. Well, I mean, Western Massachusetts, we added in, Massachusetts is not dead last, but we are
darn close.
Close. Yeah. Right. And I think a lot of that comes down to, just kind of there are a lot of issues at play there. So first off, Massachusetts is, more developed than, say,
Iowa.
Which is,
I think Iowa's first, right?
Yeah, Texas. There's a lot more open space in some of the Western states, but there's also a lot less, restrictions on what you can build. And I'm not saying we want to be, in an area where there's, far less zoning, and I don't know that you want to be all the way on the left-hand side of that graph, but I think there's steps we could take to kind of move more towards the middle.
You bring up a very good point. Restrictions on building. Is that what part of that graph shows? Is the restrictive nature of Massachusetts housing creation?
Well, I mean, we have zoning regulations for good reasons. Like they help protect the health and safety of our communities, but sometimes they can create barriers to new construction, certainly. And there's reasons I think you want to continue to have zoning, but some of the movement at the state level has
zoning can be good and bad, right?
Yeah, no, there's no. I'm not one for getting rid of zoning and just build, but I think there is reasons to try to create more opportunities for building housing in appropriate places. So at the state level, for example, they're looking at allowing accessory dwelling units or granny flats in single family zones. Kind of
ADUs are becoming more popular.
Exactly, as of right. And so, those types of changes in our zoning laws locally could help to move that number up.
All right. The next slide that I was working on trying to show it. This is the count of renter households in Western Mass by income.
Yeah, and if you did this for homeowners, it would be like the exact opposite. Renters are, often
usually the lower incomes. I mean, think about it. When I was a young 22-year-old, 3-year-old, I made no money, but I was renting. Now that I'm a 58-year-old, I can afford my own home.
Exactly.
So it's the complete opposite.
Yeah, and but I think it just points to the fact that we just don't have enough rental units available at those lower price points that would be affordable to those households at those lower income levels.
So is this an issue that we need to speak to our legislators about, looking at maybe the restrictions and the costs of building, maybe incentivize builders? Because, builders will tell you there's no money to be made in a 1,200 square foot home. They'll lose money, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. So I think that the break-even point or whatever is like 2,400 or 2,500 square feet home. But then again, that's a $450,000 home that the entry-level person can't afford. So is this a discussion we need to have with our legislative body?
I would punt a little bit on that question just because I'm much more of a research person, but I think there's a need for action at all levels. So I think there's action that could be taken place locally, folks who are, supportive of new housing, showing up at their local town meetings or planning boards, to be, supportive of new housing construction in their communities. Often folks are much more likely to show up if they're against new housing construction. And so I think showing up to say, yes, we need new housing. And I'd also say that I know Wayfinders and the Western Mass Housing Coalition work on kind of what are the legislative priorities. So I would defer to checking out those online.
But I have to imagine the addition of homes is good for the economy overall, because if you're adding homes, affordable homes, you're putting builders to work. Yep. They're buying the supplies. People are moving into those homes. And if it's more affordable, they have more discretionary income. So then they're shopping, they're buying other things. So affordable housing just boosts the entire economy of a region.
Yeah, and we actually did some economic impact analysis to kind of look at that question. And we found that if we kind of closed that gap, so if you look out to 2035, we're estimating that the gap shrinks a little bit due to changes in the population and also some construction that we believe is going to happen anyways. But we estimated that you'd see, can't remember the number of jobs, but it was over, tens of thousands of jobs would be generated and about $7 billion in new economic activity
in the next 10 years.
If we were to build enough housing to close that gap that we were talking about earlier, which, obviously we'd need that workforce, right? And so there are issues, making sure that we have enough folks in the construction industry to build that housing.
But with demand becomes career generation too. So if there's a need for a lot of building, then students at our technical schools have jobs, and the technical schools then have a better chance of recruiting the 8th graders and 7th graders to come to, so it's a full cycle.
Yeah, exactly. And I think those jobs are, they often pay fairly good wages.
Right. No college debt. Kerry Spitzer, we only hit the tip of the iceberg, but I want to thank you so very much for joining me today. Hopefully you'll come back and join me again. We can have a different conversation.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Thank you so much.
This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.